Good morning and afternoon to some of you. Welcome to today's webinar, Clarity During Crisis, Navigating Change in the Cybersecurity Sector. Today we have two presenters with us. So we have John Zanni, the CEO of Acronis SCS, an Arizona-based cyber protection and edge data security company dedicated to serving the US public sector. Before leading Acronis SCS, John held several positions within Acronis Incorporated, such as the President, CMO, and SVP of Channel and Cloud Strategy. Prior to joining Acronis, John served as the CMO at Parallels, overseeing the company's global service provider marketing function. He has also held roles at other companies such as Microsoft, and he holds a bachelor's degree in mathematical physics from the California State University. Today, we also have Recorded Future Stu Solomon, our Chief Operating Officer. Stu is responsible for setting the direction of and building and delivering Recorded Future's industry-leading threat intelligence. Currently, Stu is also the Senior Officer in the Air National Guard focused on cyber operations, and he holds a JD degree from Rutgers University of Law. He is also a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. With that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Stu and John to have a conversation today.
Outstanding. Thank you, Kelly. Very much appreciate you pulling this together and really appreciate the time and attention that those in the audience have given us to come together and listen to the conversation. Today, my guest is John, and as we just heard, John has a myriad of experiences, which I think are both professionally and personally very relevant to the discussion at hand, and pretty darn exciting, frankly, to go through today. It's obviously the second in a series of similar themed conversations in this very uncertain time that we continue to work through, and hopefully you'll find the comments today to be both enlightening and useful as you build your own strategies and deal with your own challenges. So with that, first of all, John, good morning, and thank you, sir, for joining us today. Truly appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Stu and Kelly, for having me on this. I look forward to our conversation, and hopefully I can provide some insight.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. So I'm smiling at the first question, and obviously a perfect place to begin is this notion of dealing with your own leadership style at a time of crisis. And I'm smiling because as we prepared for this conversation, you shared with me some notions of other times that you've had to deal with crisis in your career, not necessarily aligned to your role in the information security and IT world that you're in today, but very analogous from an overall approach. So some of that will come in as we go through the conversation, but let me start with the basics. Is this clearly not the first time that you've dealt with a crisis, but how is this crisis unique or different as you're approaching it in both from a leadership style perspective as well as your focus?
Well, yes, it is not the first time. The first time was in the 80s. Some people might know that I didn't start my career in tech. We're actually a family of restaurant people, and so I started my career in learning to and eventually running a French restaurant. And my first crisis was in the 1980s during that recession, where we went from a business that was running really well and quite busy to where many business people stopped going out to lunch or dinner, and we had to deal with the fact that we had a slowdown during that recession. From there, I would say it's just been a number of other crises related to tech. My next big one was probably the dot-com crash in 2000, around the 2000 timeframe. I was at Microsoft then, and many of you will probably remember or know that Microsoft went through a contraction at that point, and we had to deal with the fact that we were not just generating a bunch of cash and had to reduce staff. And once again, we had to deal with that situation. I went through 3 rounds of reductions in forces. I built an expertise that I wish I never had to, but I did. And so when that leads us through this crisis here, it's really formed the way I decided to handle it. First and foremost was really to focus on the health and safety my employees. We're a tech company, a software company, which means that without people, you really have nothing, right? The value is the intellectual property. Then the second thing is to make sure that you don't overextend yourself, so that the people we have, we could continue to employ and manage our business, so that they can also take care of themselves and their families, and in some cases their extended families during this crisis. So the focus moved to very much on people and being able to support the people that, frankly, I felt responsible for.
That definitely makes sense. And, you know, we went through very similar scenarios here at Recorded Future. I think one of the unique components, as I look back and think about, first of all, how quickly we were able to shift as a company from a culture that really works together from the earliest days of the startup mentality to being in the office and physically speaking to and working with each other day to day, with literally overnight being able to shift to an entire work from home strategy was really unique. And it had me reflecting not just on our corporate culture, but frankly on the infrastructure and the way that we had set up. So effectively a cloud first mentality to the way that the infrastructure was built, to the way that we managed our data and our applications, and even to the way that we managed our client relationships, was all predicated on very early architectural decisions that we had made to focus all of our IT resources and capabilities on the development of our product, and then use experts outside of our company to do the things that they had the expertise in, such as the computing capability, the communication and email capabilities, all of the third-party applications that we use to manage our financial functions and our client relationship functions. They all came to roost all in one time when the crisis hit, to realize that the diversification of our internal needs were very quickly met because we had made those cloud-based decisions earlier on. So that's the only thing I would add as I contemplate your response, that I think is relatively unique to this crisis management cycle versus ones that we've seen historically, is that there's much more third-party reliance and much more off-prem reliance in a lot of things that we need to do to be able to allow for a continuity of operations that we've just not necessarily been akin to in the past.
Absolutely correct. It's you can call it luck or genius, but when we created Acronis SCS about 2 years ago, we're a spin-off from a larger company uniquely focused on the public sector. I designed required that all our infrastructure was cloud-based, could support people no matter where they are, so that we weren't dependent on a physical location. Now, I'm not smart enough to have thought that there was going to be a pandemic topped with some social unrest, and that's why we needed this. But I wanted the ability to hire the best talent wherever they were, and also to just take advantage of the new technology, and it paid off. Our transition in March, when we went from an mostly in-office company to 100% remote, was quite seamless. The biggest challenge we had, frankly, was how do we help people set up their offices at home? You know, how do we get some good monitors there and a desk? And that's saved us, right? And that didn't exist, definitely didn't exist in the 80s. And even in 2000, I was one of the first non-sales remote employees at Microsoft, and the technology was not anywhere near where it is today. We couldn't be doing this with video, for example. So that's made a huge difference. We could have been a little better prepared now from a security perspective. I think we as a industry, I think we didn't expect people to be using their own devices on their home networks exclusively. And so that's caused some challenges that we had to address very quickly.
Yeah, I'm curious about that. So there are two components of your response that I think are interesting to pull the thread on a little bit more. First, it's this notion of a geographically dispersed and geographically diverse workforce. I think that's certainly part of the response to the realities of our new world from a variety of fashions have forced certainly my company, and I presume yours as well, to kind of rethink the notion of having everybody just from one place and one perspective coming together in a physical location as being the only way to be able to access the great talent all across the globe from varying perspectives. So it's been a very eye-opening experience and represents a wonderful opportunity to continue to diversify the workforce that we're working with. Have you come across similar scenarios?
Yeah, absolutely. From my perspective, at this point, bandwidth is not even that much of a problem anymore. It really is time zone difference, and being able to not be limited to a certain geography allows you to hire the best talent, no matter where they are, and frankly, give us all a better quality of life. When I moved, I was based in Redmond, Washington when I was at Microsoft. And when I ended up moving to Miami for allergy reasons, health reasons, right?
There's quite literally the longest continuous flight in the United States.
Yeah, I know, people pointed that out. But the thing is, palm trees have no pollen, right? And so it really was a health reason that drove me to make that move. And allowed me to be very productive and be quite successful after that. And so I'm a big believer in remote work, and the technology really enables it. Like I said, the only challenge is time zone. You have to also take into account flexible work hours. So one day you might be taking a phone call at 3 or 4 in the morning. Hopefully not 3, but 4 is possible, or a phone call or a video call at midnight. And then the next day you get to sleep in, right? Or balance it. But I don't think we're ever going to go back. The remote worker is here to stay.
I would agree, and in the most positive way.
Yes.
You know, one of the other comments you made was around contemplating new security angles in a scenario where individuals primarily working from their own devices and working on their home networks. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen the security challenge evolve during this period, and what you're doing to kind of focus on the uniqueness of it?
Sure. So first of all, unfortunately, the bad guys and the bad actors have realized that now the IT system or the network system of a business is expanded into the consumer world and into unsecured networks. So two things have happened because of that. One, that increases vulnerabilities. It's harder to control people updating their home device. It also creates a problem that we don't have commercial grade networks, routers, security systems at home. And as an example, even here while we're practicing, right, the internet isn't quite perfect. And that's just because we're probably both on a consumer line. I didn't pay for, commercial grade direct fiber into my house to make that happen. The second thing is the threat intelligence you want to gather, or what the bad actors are doing, now needs to really think about what they're doing in the home. There was an article or a report published by Verizon called the 2020 Data Breach Investigation Report. And according to their survey, there's a 40% increase of sensitive data on people's remote devices than before COVID, right? If I'm a bad guy, that's just like music to my ears. Less protected devices, not updated, IT can't control them, and there's more good data on there. So we've worked really hard at trying to find a balance between productivity, because I think people would react negatively to completely locking down someone's home device, and also still making sure that they're educated and understand that they have to still be careful and be secure, because people are attacking their homes, or at least their digital homes.
Absolutely, and you're right. It's always that last mile that represents a point of exploitation that we've all come to know and love. The difference is that a lot of the brick and mortar controls that we've put in place in our respective enterprise security functions are just not necessarily present, whether it be at the endpoint or whether it be at the firewall layer or even just from a VPN perspective. Some of those controls tend to have more potential vulnerability points. So that absolutely understand the perspective there. Kelly, maybe we'll move to kind of the next topic as we continue the conversation. So, you know, you talked about this a little bit, and it's this, John, of in this new connected world. I don't know. I personally find myself. I was speaking to a colleague this morning, and she said, "Well, you know, how are you dealing with 12 hours a day of being on Zoom meetings?" And in so doing, you know, it must be back to back every day, every hour. I said, no, I actually have gotten so bad now that my calendar is bifurcated into 15-minute blocks, and I'm back to back every 15 minutes with an entirely new topic and an entirely new problem and an entirely new conversation, and it's very wearing. You know, I think there's an element of resiliency planning when you think about this that equates to the human being as well as to the infrastructure itself. Do we have the right availability? Do we have the right reliance? And do we have the right integrity of the network? But just as important, are we as individuals being resilient to this new work reality? And I'm curious, maybe you could talk a little bit about your experiences as you've seen this. What are some of the more effective kind of leadership techniques and styles and communication vehicles that you've started to use as you've gone through not just the execution, but even prior to the planning for a resilient environment and resilient workforce?
Yeah, so there are a couple of components to it, and some of them might be what you would call soft components, but they're important. So to your point about all of a sudden being on Zoom calls in 15-minute increments for 12 hours, really bad, really unhealthy. Like when I'm in the office, I just make a point of walking around and talking to people. It gets me out of my chair and a little break. Well, you don't have that in a world where everyone is remote. So that means you have to plan for it and schedule it. And I do it now. Instead of walking around and talking to people, I'll walk around and give my dog a little treat. But the point there is really just to get out of my chair and get blood circulating. The second point is you don't randomly see people that you might want to talk to, so you have to be more planful about who you communicate and how often you communicate to them so you don't forget somebody. Right, and that's super important. Like we've hired a number of new employees over the last couple of weeks, and by now I would have met them in person, and I haven't. So later today we're having essentially a town hall to do that and have them just talk to me and ask me questions. All this is to say is you have to be planful about that personal resiliency. So I do have a person on my team who really is just focused on employee morale and helping them do things outside of work, thinking about how to not be on 15-minute calls for 12 hours and making sure that they plan some reflection time or downtime. The second component is that in the absence of communication, especially in ambiguous or scary situations like this virus, people will imagine things, and in many cases it's worse than it actually is. Alfred Hitchcock is probably one of the masters at that. If you look at some of his movies, most of the scary stuff happened off screen, but humans are really good at imagining what happened, and he was able to create very scary movies without the images being all that scary. Well, this is the same. If you don't communicate, people will think the worst. And so in our case, when COVID started, we literally had 3 times a week calls, town halls, where we were just sharing the data, sharing what we learned, what was happening, what was not happening. Now we've reduced them down to every other week with video communication with the whole company. And then the other week, it's a morale event, just once again, to have that communication, let them know what's happening. You know, we're not going to go bankrupt. Business is still hitting its targets. You know, in Arizona, there's been a spike in people testing positive, letting people know that there's a spike. They should be more careful. There's what are they calling it? Social distancing fatigue or isolation fatigue. And so you have to encourage people not to take a chance at this time. And so that it's super, super critical. But if you do that, it's actually very effective. I've had employees send me personal mails and say, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Oh, this was really helpful. It's those little things that'll make a big difference and help the company to continue to be productive.
I appreciate that. So we've adopted a very similar posture at Recorded Future, and absolutely sounds like kind of playing from the same playbook, which is over communicate at all levels of the company to be able to give everyone a sense of ease, but more importantly, a sense of inclusion. I think that's isolation fatigue, as you mentioned, is becoming very real. I think as all of us are starting to feel and experience it, the last thing you want to do is feel isolated in your professional workplace as well. So really making sure to over communicate and give people the opportunity to congregate in effective remote fashions is really important. You know, you mentioned some of the morale initiatives that you and your team have stood up. One of the ones that I thought was really fun and interesting that we do at Recorded Future is on a weekly basis, we have something called unprofessional education, a nice riff on professional education. And in this particular one, what we're doing is it's recognizing and celebrating that we all have these unique passions and interests outside of work, but we don't always expose each other to them. And so it's somebody going in and talking about some unique hobby or unique focus that they do when not at work to educate others on the topic. Maybe it's how to make a great souffle, or let me talk to you about beekeeping, or let's have a conversation about how to plan an RV trip across the United States. And all these rather unique topical scenarios that you would never ever discuss, but a great way to kind of get exposure to things that galvanize people and get them interested and excited. Another really fun scenario that members of the Recorded Future team did a few weeks ago was this riff on the old 1980s show MTV Cribs. I don't know if you remember it, but it was that show where you know, superstars and public personalities would effectively show off their homes. And so, you know, in this time of working from home, what a great thing to do. So the team got together, had a virtual happy hour, and did their version of that old MTV show to say, hey, let me show you what my home looks like. Let me come check out my car, come see my dog, come see my kids. And it was just it was a really fun way to kind of break the ice and cross over between the personal and professional in a way that helps you appreciate the individual. And so those are the kinds of things that we're seeing now.
Yeah, so super important. We've done similar activities. Because of my cooking background, I've sent in recipes, not only for people, but for dogs, because I cook for my dogs as well. And the thing that's important here, especially for leadership, and I know a lot of this audience work in much larger organizations than at least I'm in right now, is that you have to show by example, because people get nervous about showing their home, right? Am I gonna be judged, right? What if they see something that they don't like? And so I made a point of being one of the first that showed my office, right, with my 2 dogs at my feet, or my kitchen. And you know, my house is not perfect. It's not a model house. It's just we are who we are, right? And that encourages other people to also talk about some of their habits and their hobbies. And it's amazing what you can learn about people and the depth that they have beyond the way you see them, because you usually see them in the context of one thing only, right? Cybersecurity or cyber protection, or how are we dealing with threat intelligence? And so it's been a great experience in that aspect.
No doubt about it. I completely agree. I think let's go ahead and move into the next topic of discussion. And the next one on the hit parade. So you started to talk about this a little bit before. I'd love to put a little bit focus on this, both from the way that you're presenting your solution to the market, as well as what you're doing internally. Are you asking your security team to focus on different things in different ways? Or are you reprioritizing your security products when you take them to your clients based on the changes to our technical realities?
So I love this question. It's really interesting because Acronis SCS sells uniquely to the U.S. public sector and mostly federal government. We have a very strong secure posture because we have to be trusted by individuals who are using our software in environments that could impact national security. But even with that, I was thinking through that going, oh, well, I'm already doing everything I need to do. And then I thought about it, well, actually, that's not true, because we hadn't really thought about the remote worker as much, especially in secure environments, and what you need to do to really extend beyond and make sure that that remote worker is as secure as possible. So we did double down on making sure that it's not just within our own networks, but all the edge and endpoints that are out there. And I can tell you, pre-COVID, there were a number of groups that I talked to when I asked them about how they protect some of the endpoints. A lot of times the answers are, oh, but the endpoints aren't owned by us, right? It's the employee's phone or it's the employee's laptop, so we don't worry about that. Well, that's wrong today, right? That you absolutely have to. So our thinking and our product now even more so is focused on security of remote workloads and in uncontrolled environments where the networks are consumer grade, or where the passwords might be one that your kid can remember as well, that is not ideal for running businesses. And I'll close with an example just to show you how serious it is. There's a security company, Cyber Reason. They created a honeypot, which basically means they simulated in an external network a fake utility company. That fake company was compromised by bad actors within 3 days, right? And the reason I love that example is you also get a lot of why me, who cares about what I know? Why would you ever want to attack me? But the truth is everyone's a target, and all information's a target. And so that's how my perspective has changed. Is our priority, security has to be by default in our DNA and number one priority, because if you don't, you're putting your business or your agency at risk.
Could not agree more. I feel very strongly in that notion of security by design at the product level. I feel very strongly about multi-layered or kind of defense in depth strategies when it comes to the security posture inside the enterprise. And the two ultimately meet at the individual, and the individual has to take responsibility for that last mile of security, which is the awareness, the appropriate password hygiene, understanding the data that they're working with on a day-to-day basis, and the implications of the potential external threat environment against all of those different things from a targeting perspective. And all that happens with active education and active communication between the individual and the entity that employs them day to day, ultimately. And it's not easy. It's an age-old problem that we've been facing as a community for as long as I've been in it, which is far too long, as you can see by my gray hairs. But the concepts continue to elude our ability to control them to the most basic levels. And that's simply because of the dynamic nature of the adversary. So to your point, as the surface area of attack changes, then the malicious actors are going to change and adjust their techniques and the tools that they use to achieve those outcomes. So I'm curious, just a riff on that thought for a second. How do you build, or what's your experience thus far in building that dynamic nature back into your security program to deal with the reality of the dynamic nature of the adversary?
So there's some core traits for every Acronis Acronis SCS employee, and one of them is to be alert. And what alert means is really understanding your environment and your context. So the first thing you need to do is know what's going on, and having good sources of threat intelligence is super critical, because the bad guys use the exact same technology we do, right? They have access to machine learning, they have access to artificial intelligence, they have access to very high-powered computers. They're very well funded. It's either, in most cases, it's either organized crime or nation states. It's not your high school kid, right, who's bored in a basement. And so you need to be able to have access to the information to know what's going on and what these people are thinking, so that other people who are watching can share that with you. And of course, if you learn something, you share that with them. Once you have that, then that gives you the ability to very quickly, which is one of our next traits, makes decisions, react to it and protect yourself. So COVID was a great example. I mean, literally within weeks, we went from, a company that hardly ever mentioned remote workload. I mean, we mentioned edge and endpoint, but we didn't talk about the remote worker, to talking about the remote worker and what it means to be using Zoom, for example, or other such tools that were designed for a different environment. And so that's what you need to do, is just be aware, alert, get all the data you can, and then decide and react to it as quickly as possible.
Agreed. And it's that time to respond that's so critical. I could not agree more. All right. Well, continuing on. Let's see what's next to kind of think through here. So bringing things into a little bit more focus now, back to your specific client base, and as you've mentioned a few times in the conversation, you work primarily with the public sector, particularly with trusts in the United States. Are there any unique challenges that you've seen dealing with with your client base? And I'd love to kind of start there and then kind of expand on it a bit.
Sure. Well, one of them, but probably not for this topic, is things take longer to go through procurement because they're not used. Well, actually, they're not used to having everybody work remotely, and so finding the 6 to 10 people who have to sign that purchase order gets a little difficult. What COVID-19 has done is it's actually brought to service cybersecurity challenges that the U.S. public sector has had that they weren't addressing. So I'll touch on a few of them. First, these are really large organizations. And so we know that there's sometimes, or many times, a disconnect between what the executive thinks is their security posture and what the IT guy implementing the system thinks it is. So one might say we're secure enough, we have a good posture, we're safe, and the IT guy is thinking, oh my gosh, I have 1 out of 4 devices out of compliance. I'm 74 days out with patching my systems, which is exposing me. I hope nothing happens. And so that challenge is even more accentuated now, is how do you make sure there's alignment between people who have their feet on the ground working in the systems and the executives who are actually funding those efforts, right? And I always encourage I can't solve that for them. I'm a tool provider. The only way you solve that is to have open and honest conversations about what's going on and let people express their concerns so you can make the right risk trade-off. Excuse me.
Yeah, now that's actually an interesting point that you raise, and that ability or inability to articulate requirements and be able to frame them within business context so that the decision makers and the check writers get aligned with the people who are faced with the challenges on a more direct way day to day. That's an age-old problem. That's certainly not unique to this new post-COVID world. I think what is unique is that now you also don't have the full connectivity to be able to have those conversations in person and get the benefit of some of the intangible pushback that an individual might have. But please continue on that thought. What else have you seen?
Yeah, exactly. Zoom video helps, but it's still two-dimensional, right? And so you do miss out on there. The other part is in sensitive environments that exist in businesses, even outside of the government. You used to just be able to say, well, if you want to access this network or this system, you have to come into the office and, we'll give you a dongle and we'll have you pass through 3 layers of security and then you're in. And now all of a sudden, that doesn't work anymore. And so they've had to rethink how does a remote worker work in a secure environment. And the progression I'm seeing is the first thing they're doing is really identifying the workloads such that you can really figure out what were the workloads that the person really just has to be there, right? You don't want somebody being able to trigger a missile or a bomb, through a consumer network, right? I get that. At the same time, approving a PO, do you have to go in person to hit the approve button for a purchase order for a vendor? Probably not, right? So you have to define those workloads. Once they've defined those workloads that they're going through, is then for the ones that are appropriate for remote work, what's the right infrastructure? Like you mentioned, your defense in depth. How do you design the network? Which software do you use? How do you keep it updated? What permissions do you use? You talk about zero trust as opposed to a moat and castle model to make sure that these people can still work remotely without compromising national security, or if it's a business confidential business data. So those are the big ones, because remote work won't go away, even in the federal government. It will stay, and it's just better, right? The cloud does allow us to be more productive, have a better quality of life, and frankly, hire better talent.
I think that's really what it boils down to. Making lemonade out of lemons in this case are all the things that you've just discussed. So you're looking at things through the lens in the way that you just framed the response, working particularly with more hardened environments. But you also work in areas that don't have the same kind of military requirements associated with data protection and day-to-day work activities. For instance, I know that you work across the healthcare industry and certainly dealing with education systems as well. Do you see their challenges differing from what your experience in the DoD marketplace has been, or is it relatively similar?
It's actually relatively similar. Maybe the cause of the problem is different, but the challenge is the same. So in healthcare, the reason attacking healthcare is so attractive is people are more inclined to pay ransoms if patients could die, right? There's a sense of urgency, so that if all of a sudden a hospital's medical records are all logged down and you don't know how to treat your patients, you're going to want to get that up as quickly as possible. In education, it has more, I think, frankly, to do with the publicity in shutting down schools and showing that the schools are really not prepared for cyber attacks and weakening the country, right? If we can't get educated, or we can't educate our children and young adults, that puts us at a competitive advantage against other nation states. And so while the reasons for the attacks might be different, the fundamental result is the same. You've got bad actors going after it, which means you have to have systems in place to really understand what the threats are that are going after you and how to deal with those threats, so that you can continue to do what you need to do, whether it's treating patients or educating kids and young adults, right?
Yeah, I could not agree more. You know, it's interesting just thinking through that a little bit. I often look at it in a very similar fashion, which is, while the impacts of a potential cyber event are very personal to you and to your company and to your infrastructure and to your clients, the reality is a very different one. The outcome is, and the impact is always personal, but the reality is there's a finite number of attack vectors to exploit a finite number of vulnerabilities to create a finite number of impacts. And it really boils down to trying to think through the notion of, do I have the appropriate detective or mitigating strategies and controls in place to reduce that impact to an acceptable level of residual risk? If the answer is yes, then I'm okay. If the answer is no, then I'm not. And by the way, do I want to avoid or mitigate that impact that I know is inevitable based on that whole chain of events? And so it's always good to listen and learn from all those around you, to look and see if they're being impacted by a method or capability that could create a similar impact to you, and then judge kind of your tolerance level to be able to accommodate the same. So appreciate your thought on that for sure.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. I'd rather learn from others than learn myself through pain, right? And so that's why you have to watch and figure out and look. One of the I think you know, there's a lot of negative news around COVID-19, but one of the amazingly positive pieces of news is, look at the healthcare industry, all the etymologists, the epidemiologists, the guys working together on finding either treatment or vaccines for this disease, and the collaboration that is happening, right? If one country or one pharmaceutical company said, you know, I'm not going to talk to anybody because I want to discover the vaccine for COVID-19 and then not share, it could be years or decades, right? But the fact that they're sharing, I'm pretty confident that we'll find a solution to this pandemic much, much, much faster than we would have otherwise. And it's exactly the same analogy for cyber security and threats to your digital assets.
No, you're exactly right. And I would even extend it further to be more specific to the sharing of threat intelligence. You know, understanding how actors act, understanding the way that they try to achieve their outcomes, and being able, again, to apply it to your unique scenario, but based on an understanding of the vectors that are being used. It drives a proactive nature to security and a collaborative one across our community, which is, I think, one of the finest examples across the economy of a scenario where anti-competitive nature between companies aside, sharing of a clear understanding of cybersecurity principles between individuals from enterprise to enterprise is so critical to our collective defense. So it's absolutely agreed. Now we're coming up. We've got just a few moments left in our conversation. I think we'll move to our last question, and then also, Kaylee, I'd like to open it up to the audience if they have any particular questions that they want to ask of both John and I. We're 100% open to it. So if you could start to think through any questions that you have, John and I will kind of continue our thought for the next 2 or 3 minutes on this last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I think it's a perfect segue. We were just kind of discussing this notion of using security intelligence to better enable the security posture. And it's this idea that we were just riffing on a moment ago of collective defense, or understanding the applicability of adversarial activities and intent to be able to proactively tune your environment, particularly from a monitoring and defensive perspective, but also just learning and understanding for your more deliberate planning efforts, whether it's building out your strategy, building out your architecture, building out your spend plan, based on what and how exploitation activity is occurring, and in turn, what you have as a residual acceptable level of risk. As you've gone through the activities of late, John, have you seen any unique trends that are particularly concerning to you, and or how are your products and how are you advising clients to be able to effectively manage the threat environment today?
Yeah, so the concerning trend, which I'm not saying we should stop, it's just the reality of the world, is the democratization of technology, right? So if I'm a nation state and I want to build a nuclear bomb and send it to the United States, most likely, one, I can't because it's expensive. You need experts, and people would sort of figure out if I was starting to look on Craigslist for, you know, plutonium or uranium, and I'd get phone calls from the FBI. I might just get a phone call just having said that. But to go get a ransomware app that I can then distribute over the internet and collect ransoms using Bitcoin, fairly easy to do, and that technology is just getting easier, and the malware is getting more sophisticated. I learned, for example, through threat intelligence, that where old ransomware the equivalent would be trying to break into your front door of your house, and if you locked your door, you were good. Now they're going into the front door, the basement door, all the windows, and even through your chimney. So where you thought you might have blocked them, they found another path, and now you've been compromised again. And so without really staying up to date on what these bad actors are doing, you don't know what to do to protect yourself. Then you can act appropriately. Now, of course, there's some core basic processes you can put in place, like keeping your systems up to date, making sure you have good antivirus, anti-malware, making sure you have a good backup and recovery system. But the reality is, you know, the moment you patch your system, it's out of date, right? There's a new patch coming. And so you just have to be diligent and really be alert to know what's going on around you and react to it as quickly as possible. And that's where having that information allows you to react quickly so you can mitigate when something bad does happen.
Absolutely. You know, it's a couple of key things that you mentioned there. One is the low barrier to entry to some of the more impactful threats that we see today, whether it be ransomware or DDoS or phishing scenarios. Obviously, anybody with malicious intent has an opportunity now to be able to add a cyber nexus to the way that they do their ill-gotten activities, for sure. And then the second piece, you're right, it still boils down to the same basic notions of metrics that we've looked at as a security industry for so long. It's time to detect, time to respond. And to be able to cut down those times as quickly as possible by having a galvanized and available workforce, and by being able to, as quickly as possible, recognize the attack for what it is, and being able to isolate it in a fashion that makes the most sense. And all of that does boil down to having the context and understanding around the threat scenarios that are being captured in our detective controls. So with that, John, we've got just a few moments left together, and I will now open it up. But Kaylee, are there any questions that have come in from the audience, or anything that we'd like to further discuss?
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. That was wonderful. So now we're going to open it up for questions to the audience. So if anyone has a question, you can type it into the question or chat feature of the GoToWebinar platform. So let's see. I see one question come through right here, and please feel free to type in questions as Stu and John answer what we have. So here's one. As more and more tech vendors adopt API and connectivity first approaches, where does that leave the US government, particularly sensitive environments like those in the military?
So I can take that. So the government's a really big customer, right? So they can demand that companies who do build off-the-shelf software have a version that is not connected, right? It's as simple as that. So if I go back to my conversation about identifying the workloads where you need connectivity versus those you don't, then you can create the requirements for the kind of products you need that'll tie with the processes and the people to really solve the solution. So in our case, we do have a version of our product that is on the DoD approved product list that has zero connectivity. It is, think of a modern user interface with a technical brain of the 1980s. It just doesn't know what the internet is or the cloud. And so the attack surface is radically reduced. And I think you'll see in the future more purpose-built software for those kinds of workloads where they need it.
Yeah, I think there's another component, the notion of the commercial or civilian security industry is absolutely going down the path of API-centric scenarios for a lot of very important reasons, not the least of which is efficiency and speed to be able to get the right data elements into the right machines in the right way within the right workflow as quickly as possible. I think the government clearly recognizes this and is just as equally moving down the path. Obviously, there are more constraints from a kind of data handling perspective and from a data access perspective, but it doesn't change the notion of machine-to-machine connection to enable an appropriate security workflow. So I continue to see the same activity perpetuating in both commercial space as well as in the DoD as well.
Yeah, and look, in the early 2000s, the Apache web server was much more popular on the internet than the Microsoft web server. And it was one of the simple reasons was the Apache web server was modular, so that people who had websites at that time and apps on the site on the web could literally physically remove the modules that they didn't need, so that reduced the attack surface, where Microsoft had everything in one module, and so there was no way to remove it, which had a larger attack surface. And then what Microsoft ended up doing is moving to that same modular architecture. So there are ways to solve this problem, even with connectivity, but we have to keep that attack surface as small as possible.
Very true point. Absolutely.
Great. I see
Kelly,
a real.
Do we have anything else from the audience?
Yes, I just see one coming in from Europe, actually. Employee monitoring is very difficult in Europe, but in the post-COVID world where people are connecting over their own devices, using their own networks, do you have any recommendations on how we can continue to monitor to improve our security posture without breaching privacy?
Wow. That is a really hard question, and I'm a big privacy advocate, just to say there. So I'm not one for locking down and watching it. It's a trade-off every business has to trade-off decisions every business has to make. But just like when people use business email, we all signed documents that said that email is the property of the business and they can monitor it anytime. We have to make sure that we're at least secure enough that the bad actors can't get in while respecting people's privacy. But I'm rambling a little bit, sorry about that. With the technologies that are available now, you can look at patterns of behavior. And so what I think you'll see is through patterns of behavior, you'll be able to tell where individuals are behaving in ways that could allow you to react appropriately without invading people's privacy. So for example, if somebody went to malicious websites more than average, then you could contact that person and say something's going on here because you're using our product in a way that is putting it at risk. But I think this is something we're going to be talking and debating for a very long time.
Yeah, and I'll just add just a quick component to that as well. I've been working in this space in particular for most of my career, and I would say that it starts with fundamental notions of data classification, data protection, and data access. So obviously what what John is speaking about are kind of culling out those patterns of behavior that potentially are outside of the norm or the expected, and therefore you get a heightened level of scrutiny on the individual behavior that they have demonstrated that takes them outside of the norm. The other element is protect the data itself that you want to prevent from going out and being leaked in the first place. Not necessarily from a data leakage prevention perspective, which is a whole category of tools. What I'm thinking about more is starting out with the basic. How do you create a scenario where you have an unstructured data that's created in the first place, or data that's taken out of a system of record with specific controls and accesses that are carefully monitored and structured, and then all of a sudden the data now becomes a derivative or becomes a copy or is otherwise put on a device that has fewer controls, especially in this age of COVID, where we're now using kind of BYOD scenarios or bring your own device scenarios. And all of those basic controls have been defeated. So in my mind, it actually starts with understanding what data is critical and what the sharing around that data should be, and then looking to see how you can extend some level or moniker of control when the data enters from a structured environment to an unstructured environment, and then in turn has now circumvented many of the controls that you've put in place in the first place. So in my mind, that's the place to start, and then the next component is now to look for those malicious activities that may be indicative of badness.
Very valid points, Stu.
Thank you. So with that, to be respectful of our audience's time and yours as well, John, thank you, sir, very much for your time today. It's a very engaging and enlightening discussion. And hopefully the audience has found some value in our comments as you continue to strive to make your security the right level for what we face in today's environment. So with that, if you have any closing comments.
I first thank you for having me, Stu and Kelly. This was a pleasure. I didn't even see the hour go by. My closing comments is just do the basics to be safe, be alert, and hopefully this discussion has provided some seeds that'll let you even help protect your data more so than you did in the past.
Outstanding. Well, John, thank you and good luck, and I hope you and your family continue to stay safe.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.